All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. In this class, we're looking at essentially how to build faith. And it's very basic stuff, but it's stuff that is really important and necessary, and hopefully it'll be helpful for you. And we've come to a part of our study where we're going to talk a little bit about pain and suffering and the evil and the hurt that happens in the world, and what the Christian needs to understand about that, and what we need to have prepared to say about that. How many of you were able to go to the debate just a few weeks ago? Most of the students were, and I think you didn't have a choice. It was one of the things that came up in the debate, but because of time constraints, Kyle wasn't able to say a lot of the things that I'm sure he wanted to say, and so a lot of what this lesson is, we'll say those things. We'll go through those things. And so we're going to kind of begin by acknowledging the fact, not the idea, but the fact that we really do live in a world of hurt. Any given moment, any given person who lives anywhere can experience devastating and tragic pain. The number of, for example, natural disasters that have taken place just over the last 500 years, not to mention human existence, is a painful and upsetting thing to think about. There was an earthquake in Shaanxi, the Shaanxi earthquake in China in 1556 that killed 830,000 people. 92,000 people died in the volcanic explosion of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in 1815. Some estimate as many as 4 million people died from the flooding in China in 1931. The Bola cyclone in East Pakistan in 1970 killed 500,000 people. 230,000 people were killed by the tsunami in Indonesia in 2004. Some statistics tell us that natural disasters, on average, kill about 60,000 people a year all over the world. So there's no question that we live in a world of hurt and suffering, and some would say pointless suffering. Outside of that, outside of the things that happen naturally, we have also inflicted terrible suffering on each other over the course of human history. 3.5 million people died brutally and unnecessarily during the combat of the Roman Empire from 264 BC to 435 AD. During the Middle Ages, there was untold, unimaginable tortures inflicted on people. Zulu punishments in the early 19th century included a barbaric form of impalement, which I'm not going to talk too much more about, but there's awful things that happen over the world that people do to each other. Stalin's regime in Russia from 1924 to 1953, there were 30 million people who died by the hands of their own countrymen. Terrorist groups all over the world torture people in ways that we can barely imagine. And then there's the random, seemingly random illnesses and diseases and vehicle accidents and shipwrecks and plane crashes and guns that go off that weren't supposed to go off. Teenagers, college students suffer in ways that don't involve death. There's more depressed people than ever, more anxious people than ever, more likely to commit suicide than ever before. Divorce, dysfunction, neglect, abuse, mental illness, substance abuse. Recent studies just found out that 5 times as many high school and college students are dealing with anxiety and other mental health issues as youth the same age did during the Great Depression. So think about that. 5 times more people your age are dealing with mental health disorders as they were during the actual Great Depression. So there's a lot of hurt. And anybody who says, well, no, that's really not true. That's not the case. We don't live in a world like that. Well, that's just not being honest. The question is all of that a problem? philosophically, theologically, for a person who claims to believe in God. This is part of our spiritual landscape, if you will, that we've been looking at in this class. And it is something we need to address. It is something that as we look out into the world we live in, we have to be able to talk about this. We have to be able to have answers for this. Why does this happen? How can God allow this to happen? Where is He during these things? Do these examples of hurt and pain and suffering nullify the existence of God? Those are the questions that we have to deal with. I'll go ahead and let you know that this is the tip of the iceberg when it comes to God and evil and human suffering. And so if you have questions or your friends have questions that are not answered in this class, there's a lot more you can do to study it. And I would encourage you to do that. And there'll be some things that I put on the board later that you can have access to. So we'll talk about it a little bit this week and probably for the next couple of weeks and see where we can get. But we're going to begin with what we would just say is the reality. Okay, we sort of just talked about that a little bit. But here's the reality, is that suffering and evil exist in a world that was created by an all-loving and all-powerful God. Don't try to deny that. That's just a statement of reality. And we know that God is all-loving because of 1 John 4:8. He who does not love does not know God, for what? God is love. Genesis 17:1, when Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am Almighty God. What does Almighty mean? I have all power. So I am all-loving and I am all-powerful. And yet, we live in a world where evil and suffering and pain exist. And in their own words, this is some of the things that atheists say. That this is a huge problem. This fact that we just put on the board is a paradox, and that it's proof that the God of the Bible cannot and does not exist. So this is what they say in their own words. This is Sam Harris. He wrote this in 2005 as he reflected on Hurricane Katrina. If God exists, either He can do nothing to stop the most egregious calamities, or He does not care to. God, therefore, is either impotent, which means powerless, or evil. Okay? So, in the same article, this is some other things that he went on to say. Consider the city of New Orleans was recently destroyed by Hurricane Katrina. At least 1,000 people died. Tens of thousands lost all their earthly possessions. Over 1 million have been displaced. It is safe to say that almost every person living in New Orleans at the moment Katrina struck believed in an omnipotent, omniscient, and compassionate God. But what was God doing while the hurricane laid waste to their city? Surely He heard the prayers of those elderly men and women who fled the rising waters for the safety of their attics, only to be slowly drowned there. These were people of faith. These were good men and women who had prayed throughout their lives. Only the atheist has the courage to admit the obvious. These poor people spent their lives in the company of an imaginary friend. Only the atheist recognizes the boundless narcissism and self-deceit of the saved. Only the atheist realizes how morally objectionable it is for survivors of a catastrophe to believe themselves spared by a loving God, while this same God drowned infants in their cribs. Pretty hard to hear stuff like that. And there are some things in there, some facts that he points to that are undeniable. In his 2009 debate with Kyle Butt, Dan Barker, who is a former denominational evangelist turned atheist, he said this. He said, there are no good replies to the arguments against the existence of God, such as the problem of evil. All you have to do is walk into any children's hospital and you know there is no God. Prayer doesn't make any difference. Those people pray for their beloved children to live, and they die. Legitimate problem for you and I as believers? Anybody want to hear another person, maybe with tears in their eyes, come to you and say something like this, and you say, well, I don't have to answer that. That's not something I have to defend. We can't blow that off, really, can we? As people of faith, as people who believe in God or say that we believe in God, do we need to be able to answer this? And why? What do you think? Anybody awake?
Things like this are gonna happen no matter what we do, so it's best we be prepared for it, for when we do have to give an answer.
Okay. First of all, something like this may happen to you or your family. This kind of hurt, this kind of pain, this kind of suffering. And I would say if you don't know an answer to why, you may lose your own faith. If you haven't thought about this and what you might say when something like that happens, if your family was swept up in a flood or an earthquake or something like that, I mean, what would you do? What would that do to your faith? How would you answer these questions that would inevitably come up in your own mind? That's an important thing to think about. Much less the idea that somebody we know or love has had this happen and we don't know what to say to them. We don't know how to answer them. We don't know how to explain or attempt to explain. You know, I would say that some people use this concept as an excuse not to believe in God. I think that's a fact. But some people are legitimately wondering why this kind of thing is the case. Okay, how could God, who's all loving and all powerful, allow things like this to happen? And so if we meet somebody and we try to answer and we give them evidence and it's still not enough, then we might be dealing with somebody who just doesn't want to believe. But in general, these are legitimate questions. And these are things that if you believe in God, you've got to be able to at least give some answer to. So let's look at some reasonable responses, okay? Proverbs chapter 18, verse 17 says this. Actually, one of you guys read that. Proverbs 18, 17.
The one who states his case first seems right, until the other comes and examines himself.
Okay, the one who states his case first seems right. A lot of you are probably sitting in this class thinking, well, I sure hope he gives us an answer to this because what he just read sounds awful difficult. I wouldn't know what to say to that. It might seem even, for some of you who haven't studied this much, it might seem even like, well, that's an insurmountable case against God. I don't know what you're going to say to that. And so, some reasonable responses need to be discussed because, you know, just because somebody presents a good case for something, maybe even sounds right, it doesn't mean there's not another side to it. So here's something that we might ask. Where did you get all of these ideas? Let's think about the statements from the two men that we just looked at. We heard words like evil, good, omnipotent, omniscient, and loving. So here's a reasonable response. I think it would be to say that those concepts would not exist without the Bible. Those concepts come from Scripture. And so if we use them at all, then we are depending in some cases on the Bible to get them from. Because we didn't come up with any of these ideas. And so if the Bible can be used to formulate and frame the problem, as it has been used to do that, that's where all those ideas come from. If it can be used to formulate and frame the problem, then what else should we do with the Bible? Can we answer the problem from the Bible? Yeah. If you're going to go to the Bible to tell us what the problem is, and you're going to use the Bible's words and the Bible's concepts to tell us what the problem is, well, we're going to go back to the Bible to answer the problem. And by the way, this is something that the atheistic community doesn't allow. They'll borrow from the Bible to tell you what the problem is, but they won't let you use the Bible to answer it. Is that fair? No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to say, well, God said this, this, and this, and this, and that's a problem, but you can't quote Scripture to me to answer it. Well, that's unfair. That's hypocritical. So another reasonable response might be, number one, you know, where did you get, and that's a good question you could ask, where did you get the idea of good and evil? Where did you get the idea of suffering? What makes you think that's bad? Because if we all just came from nothing, if we all evolved like atheists think that we do, then what's good and what's bad and what's right and what's wrong and what matters and what doesn't? See where I'm going? You don't get to have it both ways. You don't get to say there's no God and at the same time, why are things so bad? What does that mean? It's unfair. It's kind of duplicitous. Robert?
Henry, you're so right to ask people to ask that question. And keep asking. I mean, they're gonna more than likely give some flippant answer, they're gonna say something, they may point back to the Bible, which obviously is unfair, right? But they may give a flippant answer and say, well, it's for greater human flourishing. Oh, okay, in whose opinion?
Yeah.
I mean, you know, there are two sides to the evil. The person, presuming we're talking about moral evil, there are people doing the evil, there are people on the receiving end of the evil. The person on the receiving end probably thinks it's pretty bad. The person on the giving end may not think it's bad at all.
Yeah.
Well, who gets to decide?
Yeah. And we're going to talk about that specifically in just a moment, but it's a good beginning question to, at least in your own mind, to think, okay, where'd you get all these ideas? Where'd you get these concepts? Because without God, without the Bible, if everything just came from ooze, we don't have any of those things. There is nothing like that we can point to that we didn't come up with on our own. And if you came up with it on your own, then we don't have to answer for that, right? So the atheist who appeals to the Bible for the problem has to allow the Bible to answer it. What about this one? Isn't some suffering necessary and acceptable? Atheists themselves will concede some suffering is necessary in our world. Most normal, rational people will agree with this, okay? Dan Barker said this: you can't get through life without some harm. I think we all agree that it's wrong to stick a needle into a baby. That's horrible, but if that baby needs a life-saving injection, we will cause that harm. We will do that. The baby won't understand it, but we will do that because there's a greater good. So humanistic morality understands that within certain situations there is harm and there's a trade-off of values. So again, you see what's happening. We're borrowing the concept of morality and good and bad from the Bible, but now he's saying, well, you know, some of this is okay. Some suffering is all right, as long as there's a greater good. Again, where did that come from? Have you heard the term moving the goalposts? Anybody ever heard that term? You know what that means? If you were playing football and somebody moved the goalposts, what are they essentially doing in the middle of a game?
Cheating.
They're cheating. They're changing the rules. Like, we're almost to the end zone. No, you're not. We're moving it. We're moving it back 20 yards. That's the idea. It's a phrase that means one side in an argument changes the guidelines in the middle of the game. And atheists constantly move the goalposts. They're constantly changing their arguments in an important way when they admit that some suffering is acceptable and even good or useful. They'll admit that. Okay? Every human being admits that. So here's your next question. This is another reasonable response. How much suffering is acceptable and what kind? Because the atheist has put themselves in a very precarious position. They're making God-like decisions about the nature and value of something that by their own admission shouldn't even exist. They're saying this shouldn't happen. But then they're saying, but it's going to, and some of it's okay. Well, who gets to make that decision? We're firmly in the realm now of subjective opinion, aren't we? We're at the mercy here of whatever arbitrary judgment this fallible, human, unbelieving person might make about this, right? However, we're eventually faced, I think the believer is, with an honest and at least partially legitimate question. and that's probably this question. What about the unnecessary suffering? Because this is where most atheists, and Michael Shermer did this as well during the debate, they take their stand a lot more firmly in the realm of what they seem to think is unnecessary, pointless, unabsorbed suffering, if you will. In other words, there is no reasonable explanation for why an all-loving, all-powerful God would allow suffering that seems to have no point, no purpose. Now again, first of all, notice, we're in the realm of the subjective here. Who gets to decide what's necessary and what's unnecessary? Who does that? Well, the unbeliever would claim to be able to, but so would the believer. So does the atheist claim to have the answer to that question? In some cases they do. Tim Keller once said it this way. He's a denominational preacher and he passed away last year. But he had something helpful to say. He said, tucked away within the assertion that the world is filled with pointless evil is a hidden premise. Namely, that if evil appears pointless to me, then it must be pointless. You hear what he's saying? There's a premise tucked in. It's hiding in plain sight. If you think something is pointless, then it must be pointless. And the reasoning is fallacious. Just because you can't see or imagine a good reason why God might allow something to happen doesn't mean there can't be one. Is everybody in here humble enough to admit that you might not understand why something happens? That you might understand later, or much later, or in eternity even, why God allowed something to happen. So again, these are questions that you can ask. Sometimes we get put in these positions about evil, pain, and suffering, and we feel like, well, I've got to have an answer. And I do think that we do, but sometimes the answer is another question. And maybe 2 or 3 or 4 other follow-up questions to get the person who's asking their questions to think about their own questions and where they've come from. And why some of those questions are simply not fair. And the way that they've framed it is just something that's not fair. See? Okay, so some rational, some reasonable responses is what we've covered here. So let's talk about some rational reasons, okay? The responses is things that you can just say or ask to level the playing field a little bit. But let's talk about some reasons from the same Bible that tells us about God's omniscience and omnipotence for the existence of evil and suffering. Here's a few reasons why it exists, okay? This is what you can show people. Number 1 is sin. This is a rational reason for the existence of evil and human suffering, and it's the biblical concept of sin. Jordan Peterson said this: human beings have a great capacity for wrongdoing. It's an attribute that is unique in the world of life. We can and do make things worse voluntarily with full knowledge of what we are doing, as well as accidentally and carelessly and in a manner that is willfully blind. We have a proclivity for malevolent actions. Now, he's correct. We saw some of the evidence of that at the beginning of class, but he doesn't quite get biblical enough with his terminology. The true wrongdoing, the true malevolent action that he's referring to is more accurately labeled what? Sin. That's what he's talking about. He just doesn't call it that. So only the Bible can inform humans as to what sin is. Jordan Peterson doesn't get to decide that. He knows about it. He's seen it. He's experienced it. He's a really smart person, but he's not calling it by the right name. And maybe he doesn't quite understand what makes this bad or wrong, but the Bible tells us what sin is. Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. Sin is when you see what God's law is and you decide to do the opposite. You decide to break that law, break that rule. Now, when we sin, we transgress God's law, bad things happen. Consequences, as we've seen since Genesis chapter 3, right? There's consequences that follow that we cannot escape. Now, let me just put a short list, a relatively short list of sins on the board. Just take a look at this. I'm just going to give you a minute to look at these sins. This is not an exhaustive list. But take a look through there and read what Jordan Peterson is calling, malevolence, wrongdoing. Well, he's talking about sin, and this is some of the sins that people commit. So now that you've kind of got this in your mind, how much evil and suffering has been caused by the decisions that people have made to engage in those sins? How much? A little? A lot? A whole lot? I mean, how much of the suffering in your own life is a result of the sins that you've either committed or people have committed against you? I mean, this is a huge reason why pain and suffering and evil exists. Transgressing God's law. But let's say in the case of the drunk driver whose sin causes the death of an innocent person, we might ask the question, is this fair? Is this fair that this happens? Is it fair that sin has these far-reaching consequences to people who didn't do it? Well, the honest answer, that's not always fair. But Dave Miller points out in his book about this that unfairness does not reflect negatively on the justice of God or make him blameworthy. When humans are free to make their own decisions, they may well make wrong decisions. And my children have been asking me since they were 5 or 6 years old, why did God make a world like that? You probably asked the same question when you were real little. Why did God make a world where people could make bad decisions and there could be all these consequences because of sin? Couldn't God create a world where people couldn't cause this kind of evil and suffering? I mean, it's a good question. It's an honest question. And I've heard it from the mouths of my children many times. But here's something to think about. To suggest that God could have eliminated the possibility of pain, evil, and suffering while also giving human beings the ability to make their own decisions is nonsense. It's the best word for it. It's just nonsense. You know God couldn't have done that. And still allowed you and me the ability to choose. Our tendency and our capacity to sin causes a lot of the evil and suffering in the world. And it's not the only rational reason that we're given in the Bible, but it's a big one. A lot of the things we mentioned at the beginning of the class were a direct result of sin. They weren't natural disasters. They were people doing sinful things to one another. So that's our first rational reason why we've got a lot of this. Here's another one. We might call it the scheme. And sometimes scheme means somebody's trying to get something over on you, but in this case, scheme means a plan or a design or a purpose. So let's talk about that for a moment. If I show you a picture like this, do we live in a world like this where rocks float? You might think of Avatar or something like that, where part of the planet is just floating in midair. Do we live in a kind of world like that? No, it looks kind of cool in movies. But what's happening here? What is being violated in this picture? Gravity. Okay? Now you might look at that and think, that is cool. I like to live in that world. But would you like to live in a world where there is no gravity? Or that it's random and applies to some things and doesn't apply to other things? Or are you more thankful than you may have realized for a world where gravity is a law? You can count on it. And there are no exceptions. Unfortunately, the laws work both ways, don't they? Gravity keeps you on the ground. It keeps you from floating in the air like these rocks, but it works both ways. If somebody steps off the roof of the Empire State Building, the same law that keeps you from floating into space will pull you down pretty hard and fast from that tall building. Kyle put it this way in his book, Out with Doubt. God created a world ruled by natural laws. All of nature is regulated by natural laws set in place by God. They are the same for everyone, believer and unbeliever alike. You see this in the Bible in a place like Luke 13, where Jesus tells the story of 18 people who died when the Tower of Siloam fell on them. It wasn't a punishment. It wasn't the result of some particularly bad sin that they had committed. It was because gravity worked. Gravity brought the tower down. They happened to be standing underneath it, and it killed them. And this is why parents tell their children, don't play in the street. Be careful climbing tall trees. Gravity, along with all the other natural laws of the world we live in, is no respecter of persons. Okay? Another aspect of the scheme and the purpose for this world can be seen even in the words of a passionate atheist and philosopher like Friedrich Nietzsche. Listen to what he said. He said, we believe that severity, violence, slavery, danger in the street and in the heart, and devilry of every kind, and everything wicked, terrible, tyrannical, predatory, and serpentine in man serves as well for the elevation of the human species as its opposite. So what he's admitting, he's an atheist, is that the presence of evil and suffering can provide positive outcomes in the lives of human beings. Even unbelievers would tell you that. Something good came out of that. Something positive came out of all of that bad. And this deserves some attention biblically. Dave said it this way, no one has all the answers regarding the matter of suffering. However, only the Christian worldview and the explanations provided by the Bible can enable a person to fit all the puzzle pieces together to make sense of suffering. In other words, if you aren't a believer and you say that all these bad things happen, and you don't know why, well, you're never going to know why. You're never going to have an answer. You're going to live with that problem for the rest of your life, and you're never going to be able to go anywhere of any substance and provide an answer for that. So here's the question we really need to be asking. What is the scheme and the purpose of our earthly life? What is this life for? And does that matter in our discussion of evil, pain, and suffering? What do you think? Is this a relevant part of answering the question? You know, what are we doing here? What's the point? And if there's an answer to that that helps us answer why there's pain and suffering, then this is a good path to go down when people have this question. What do you think? What's the purpose of our earthly life? To be happy? To succeed? To get a lot of stuff? To never fail? What is it? And who decides that? You see why that matters? Because if the atheist is right in their thinking that once this life is over, there is nothing else, then what difference does it make? And why is it a problem? So here's what the believer has to admit, that this life is a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of our existence. And so with that in mind, with the fact in mind that our lives our earthly lives are a fraction of that, we need to consider this. So when God created the earth, He intended to provide a realm, a suitable environment in which human beings could live and prepare for eternity. In creating this realm of spiritual preparation, God put into play every variable necessary to achieve this purpose. What do you see in the middle of that screen? Do you see that little dot? So you look closely, you'll see that little dot. That little dot is your life. And the black around it is eternity, but it extends in every direction forever. And just this dot on this screen gives you some instance of how small your actual earthly life is in relation to eternity. But think of the black of that screen going everywhere, in every direction, forever. And that's still your life. And so, if we believe in God, if we believe in the Bible and Jesus Christ, we know that as important as this life is, it is a speck in relation to the eternity and the infinity that awaits us. And so, with that in mind, God designed earth not simply and merely for our temporary enjoyment, not to be a place where there were never any problems. But here are some of the designs and the schemes of this world. To supply our basic physical needs, to allow us to have free will, to allow us to be challenged, and to allow us to learn the things we most need to learn. Now, you might reject that. A lot of people certainly do. But if you believe this, then it certainly helps answer the question of why God allows so many quote-unquote bad and evil things to happen. Well, it's because partly He's preparing you for something else. And so, if we take that out of the equation, it doesn't make much sense. But if we consider this is just nothing compared to where we're headed, and this is intended to prepare us for eternity, well, that's a helpful thing to think about. Now, for an atheist who doesn't believe this, maybe they don't accept that for themselves, but does that mean you haven't given them an answer from the same Bible that they borrowed from? No, you've given them a reasonable answer. If they're going to the Bible and appealing to the Bible for the concept of good and bad and evil and righteousness, then you can answer with these. Let's talk about the supremacy as a third rational reason here. The supremacy of God as a rational reason why we can accept and should accept the existence of evil and suffering. If there truly is an omniscient God who knows every consequence of every action that ever has been or ever will be taken, then that being, and only that being, would be in a position to speak with absolute authority about the amount and kind of suffering that is quote-unquote necessary. Would you agree with that? That's the kind of being that you would have to be to have any authority to say what kind of suffering is necessary and what kind is unnecessary. You'd have to know everything. And none of us do. So whose mind knows more about the consequences of all actions? Whose mind is in a better position to know what will happen if this action is permitted? Whose mind has the ability to see the bigger picture? Who alone is in the position to know how much suffering is permissible to bring about the ultimate good for humankind? That would be the infinite, eternal, omniscient Creator, the God of the Bible. So, as we think about this, how important is it for a believer in God to be able to give an answer to the existence of evil and suffering? How important is that? I know that's kind of a strange question. You probably think, what am I supposed to say? It's very important. It is, right? Has this come up in your life yet? Anybody want to share how it's come up and what you said and how that went? This is a real thing. This is not just theoretical. Yes, ma'am.
I think that, like, in my life personally, anytime there's been amounts of a lot of suffering, there hasn't been a time that I haven't still seen God's goodness in that situation. Like, at funerals, for example, like, that can really wreck somebody, but you still see, crazy amounts of comfort being given to people and compassion and kindness. And sometimes it takes a long time to sit back and be like, I might not know why that happened to me, but I do know that through all of that, I still saw God's presence in my life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's important to hold on to that.
Yeah, that's a good point. The story of Job is something we'll talk more about next week, but Job made a decision when he experienced pain and suffering, didn't he? He certainly experienced it just like any of us would, but he made a decision about how he was going to feel about God, didn't he? And that made all the difference in how he responded. If anybody could ever say, boy, a loving God would never allow something like this to happen, it probably would have been him. And yet he didn't say that. And so I think you're right that some of the most, some of the times in which God's work is most effective, most seen, most needed, is when people are hurting. And you think about a situation like Hurricane Katrina. Did God's people respond? I know that where we were at the time, we did. I can remember in 2011, a big tornado ripped through Tuscaloosa. And the response of God's people in that tragic time was profound. And without that, all you have is hurt. All you have is pain and suffering. But then what you see when God's people show up is you see, there's more to learn from this. So I can't imagine, and this is just me personally, I can't imagine being an atheist and having a tornado run through my neighborhood and take one of my family members and not having any, where do you go for comfort? What is that? What does comfort mean to an atheist? Are you even allowed to have that idea in your mind? And if so, why? Where'd you get that? Nobody wants to be hopeless, do they? Nobody, when pain and suffering hits them, wants to be hopeless. And, well, there's no way out of this. There's nothing good that can happen because of this. God provides light in the midst of darkness. And even though the darkness is great, it can point people to the light. And so one of the things that you need to keep in mind when you're talking to people who maybe this is not a theoretical argument for them, maybe they've experienced it in their lives, you can offer hope. And you as a believer can show them love and compassion and can bring something good into a bad situation. And perhaps that's the argument, if you will, that will be most effective for some of these people who have experienced such pain and suffering. Because you don't make this argument about pain and suffering unless you would kind of like to believe that there's hope. Otherwise, who cares? Who cares how much pain and suffering are in the world? Unless you'd really rather there be something better. And I think everyone would. I want to put this up if you want to go deeper into this study, if you have some questions that we haven't answered today. This will take you to a section on the AP website that contains at least 15 articles on the theme of human suffering. So feel free, I'll leave that on the screen. Feel free to scan that. If you have to get closer after class, you can. There's a lot more that could be said about this. We'll go into a study of Job in particular next week and see what else we can learn. But any thoughts or comments or questions that you guys have at this point?
I would think that it probably would be important. This depends on who it is that's suffering and your relationship with them and how well you know them. But when someone approaches you with these kinds of feelings and these thoughts, if they're still grieving greatly, maybe it's not the best idea to present all of the arguments that you found on the safety website during their time of extreme emotional anguish, because they're not going to be able to take in I feel like these are arguments that you really go to someone who is actually struggling with it and not sure.
If they're struggling with it as an argument,
Right.
then you can respond in kind. But if they're struggling with it personally, then your best argument is to love them. They will know we are Christians by the love that we have for each other and for other people, not by our great arguments necessarily, even though we should have them. Nate's right. If you run into somebody who talks to you about this, the first question you ought to probably ask is, are you suffering right now? What happened in your life? What's gone wrong? And then offer to help. Be a comfort yourself. With the comfort that God has shown to you, 2 Corinthians chapter 1. So I think that's the very best approach if you meet somebody who's actually suffering. But odds are, most of the people that you'll meet, this is an argument. This is a kind of a textbook type defense against God that you'll hear a lot. But don't mistake the fact that everyone hurts, everyone has been touched by it, and the person you're talking to probably has something in their life. Most atheists, if not all of them, and you heard this in the debate, they have come to the place where they are not necessarily because of an argument, but because of something that happened that they couldn't explain. They wouldn't accept the explanation, whatever. And so approach this with love, with compassion, with kindness, with patience, and it'll probably pay off better for you than to say, well, let me send you an article. Now, there may come a time for that, but be God's people, be His representatives, show love, give hope, and I think that will do more to counter this than you might imagine. There are some handouts, if you didn't get one, over here on the table that you can take with you if you'd like to. Thank you guys for being here this morning. Appreciate you very much.